Okay, so welcome to the next Architecture Weekly and GitHub sponsors webinar. Thanks all who joined live and welcome all that are watching that as a recording. So maybe a short introduction. We will have today a special guest, Mário Bittencourt. Thank you a lot for joining. And we will be talking about BPMN. And I will let Mário tell you more what's BPMN and why we should think about that. But a short story from my side is that recently, through my consultancy and working with the clients and also in the community, I had a lot of discussions around how to document and how to create a live experience of the documentation. Because I think that right now we are quite like the tooling, like event storming, event modeling are quite widespread and understood. Those are great tools, but I would say that it's not super easy to maintain them and keep them up to date with the changing requirements, with the changing development. So it's doable. I have some of my heuristics, but I wouldn't say that they are necessarily prescriptive. And that's why I started to look for widening my tool set and horizons. And I thought that, yeah, maybe BPMN could be an interesting option. And I'm super happy that Mário agreed to share with us his practical experience. So that's all from me. I won't be boring you because we have more interesting stuff to do. So yeah, Mário, thank you, and yeah, you can go ahead.
All right. So thank you, Oscar, for inviting me and for everyone that joined today and for our future audience that watched the recording. Yes, we're going to talk about BPMN, and I like to frame it as in for profit and fun. And hopefully I'll be able to convince you of this during the presentation. So a bit about myself before we jump into the right material is I'm currently a software architect here in Canada for a company called Essence, which is an e-tailer. And I've been working with technology development for 30 years already. And one of the things, as someone that is still a developer at heart, is that I like and I am excited by technology. But over the years, I've been growing more into this is awesome, but what problem is it trying to solve? And should we be using this in what context? And BPMN, and hopefully I'll be able to showcase, falls under that criteria as well. I'm leaving here some of my contacts in case you want to reach out. And of course, in the Discord channel where I'll hang with Oscar and all the other members. With that, our agenda for today is this one, where essentially I will say that the most important part that I want you to leave is the why. So I will explain a bit what was my journey or my experience and why I feel BPMN is an interesting tool to be leveraged alongside anything else that you may already be using. Then I want to go and promise to do it quickly, a very basic intro where I'm going to showcase the basic elements that we have. I'm assuming nobody has any real experience with BPMN, and I'll try to, not only in this section, but throughout the presentation, answer the question, is BPMN a heavy thing to be adopted? or can I, really go without feeling that I have to learn yet something with a steep learning curve. Then we're going to kind of abandon the presentation, and I'm going to use the tool to showcase a fictitious example, but where we would be building a BPMN, and I will try to demonstrate the very basic elements that I just discussed about it, but with a more practical note, right? Like any example has to be contrived so it can fit within the time that we have here, but hopefully it gives enough idea to say, okay, I can use it and I can take it away to my own projects. I'll close off, resuming to this presentation, talking about a very simple process, right? A set of steps that you can use and adapt to your own liking that I feel helped me to apply BPMN through my projects. And because everything is easy in theory until you actually try and you stumble across issues, I want to cover not necessarily the most common, but the ones that I feel are the usual when you're starting, right? So if you're going to begin, or if you're going to roll out this practice among your team members, those are the kind of issues that I see with very simple or easy to solve tips. We'll then switch for a Q&A mode that we can explore items that I have not covered throughout the presentation or expand on them. So let's start with the why, right? Again, to me, this is the most important part of the presentation because it's the one where I try to showcase the reason why BPMN is a good option. And to do that, let me try to go with what I believe is a somewhat common experience. If you're like me, you're working with your company or with your clients, and they come with an intent, a desire to that requires some developments, a new feature, which may or may not be a new service or a new component, etc. But usually this is more like a vision, and it gets presented to you, especially if you follow some sort of, I want to call a Jira-based process where they create tickets. And if they follow some sort of agile, you're going to see this as user stories, where you have that intent broken down into a set of user stories, and those user stories are usually tickets. And to me, more often than not, the first one has some information, maybe some acceptance criteria, some details about what is expected, but the other ones have less and less, to the point where they may be a simple title just revealing what is that supposed to be. So I find this a common experience that I've seen across many companies and colleagues speaking to me about their challenges. And from there, usually we have one or a combination of the following paths. Well, we are developers, we want to code, so we jump right into coding, right? So we got that first story, we read about it, okay, jump immediately into coding. The second one is, okay, I have that story, I have to maybe think more about it, and I go into one or more of technical documents, and here I'm representing, you know, a C4 or maybe a class diagram from UML, or maybe a data model that you're putting for your persistence, right? So, and maybe with that you go back to the coding, but I see more or less the experience swinging between one of those two ones. And you could say, well, is that a problem? To me, it can be, right? With exception of very simple use cases where it's you know, it's maybe it's an incremental change that on its own, it's a very simple one. I would say that definitely going directly into the coding or maybe to the technical aspect, it's going to be the route to go. But if you do this in general, you're going to stumble the fact that you may be jumping directly into the solutioning without understanding the problem, right? Again, I'm going back to what I described as the common experience. You have a fragmented view of the entire feature because that's what was captured in that user story. And because you're just looking at that user story, that's the extent of your knowledge, right? So you may jumping already. So you may have started coding or proposed a persistence, or if you're using some class structure, and you don't actually understand enough about the problem. Second is still associated with that is you may jump to, you know, making too many decisions up front. Why? Because you are already in the development mode and you are already thinking about your table structure or your document structure and which persistence you're going to use and so on. Again, without necessarily having discussed or understood the problem. And finally is that you create, and I want to call prematurely, silos on the knowledge. Again, code or some of the other artifacts that I mentioned, they are technical in nature. So there's only one audience that is going to understand or potentially care about them. It's us, the developers. And that's a problem because even if you do not follow agile, you know, methodology, you know that your non-technical counterparts, either I'm going to refer during this presentation to at least three roles, like a business stakeholder, your product, and us engineering, the development team in a way. So only the developer team will be looking and understanding and benefiting from that document. So you are creating a silo where you cannot use that document or, hello? So you're not going to create that document and be able to easily share or use it to discuss with your peers, right? And if we agree that those are potential issues that may come, what's the solution? Well, unsurprisingly, BPMN, right? So I stumbled across BPMN a long time ago in a project while I was integrating with SAP, because one of the parts of the SAP solution actually had a business process engine and used BPMN to model certain aspects that actually got executed. So I first noticed that and said, that's interesting. But it's even taken a lot further because it reflects the actual execution that you are controlling. But behind that is this standard notation that has been developed for a while. The last version 2.0 is from 2011, that essentially focus from the name on something that I feel interesting: business process. So whether you are adopting a domain-driven design or a similar, you know that looking from the domain perspective, which essentially means coming from the business, which is the one that define in many ways, right, the rules around your domain, it's an interesting approach. So to me, and I'm picking a very short process just to illustrate, you have a begin and an end where you can visually share with anyone, developers or not developers alike, what your process is supposed to do. So this to me is extremely powerful because it tries to address all the three limitations or negative characteristics that I previously mentioned, right? So it's a non-technical document, so you're not creating the silo. Any one of those three personas can look, interact, and contribute to this document because it is aligned to that. Because you're building that prior to coding, or as you are going to code, every iteration you enhance it, it is somewhat preventing you from making too many decisions without knowing at least enough. And finally, you are actually enhancing your knowledge of the problem, because you see this, and throughout the examples, there are other parts that are made explicit, such as dependencies. You can start building a better understanding of the problem. And just giving as a hint, the names that you would see around the diagram, they could be, or should be, part of your ubiquitous language, because they are not supposed to be technical in nature, and they are constructed and interacted with your business/product. So you use the terminology that essentially should be the one that they should be using as well to refer under the domain being worked on. So it is an interesting approach that it's also somewhat easy to build. So there is a handful of elements that are necessary to create a diagram, which leads us to the so-called basic elements. So in BPMN, if you go research the spec of BPMN, is a document with more than 500 pages, which may sound contradictory to what I just said. But like any spec, it goes into very minutiae detail, especially for those who want to develop software to understand the diagrams and so on. But in practice, you have elements that are grouped in 4 types. And we're going to talk about those 4 types of elements right now. And we're going to see that understanding the elements, does not take so long. What takes time is actually knowing how to use them as part of your modeling skills. So the very first group is called flow objects. And essentially, those are the elements that we are going to be using throughout any process that we model with BPMN. So we have events, which are essentially triggers, right? Especially the begin one to start a process. Intermediate, those that happen, well, after the process has started. And end event is the outcome. After my process has finished, there is an end event here. Not to be confused with the technical implementation. It's very important for us to go. BPMN is not technical, right? So those events, they do not necessarily mean messages to be sent through some sort of messaging infrastructure. They're really just capturing what is expected to happen or has happened to start your process. Then we have activities. Activities are those rectangles where your actual tasks are going to take place. So do something as part of your process would be one task. I'm here showcasing one of the most common types of activities that are also the sub-process. Sub-process is, like the name says, a collection of other flow objects that you want to collapse to serve either to be reused or to be just a helper on your diagramming skills. Because if you have a diagram that's too big, you may have a difficulty to follow and understand. So has the same encapsulation aspects that you would see when you create a function or a method, in a way that you are hiding the level of detail. And finally, gateways. You are essentially talking about some sort of branching on the most common case. And here you have at least two of the common ones, which is exclusive or parallel. So exclusive, it's an or, right? So it's only one option that of this branching that will be executed at a time. Parallel, all of them at the same time will take place. Every object that we saw, you may need to connect to other objects. And if you have those objects being part of the same process, you're going to use the upper, the arrow. And when you are communicating between processes, you're going to use this other dashed arrow approach. So you're just establishing what's the convention that you would go. And here I'm just putting two tasks, but you can use any of the flow objects that we saw before. Then going to a bit more advanced, we have the concepts of pools and swim lanes. When you go into BPMN, you're going to see pool as just as a grouping mechanism. So when you need to differentiate and to restrict by adding some sort of boundaries on this process, you're going to use those swim lanes. Pools and swim lanes. The common example that you're going to be referring is, well, I may have a pool for each participant of a process, maybe a different company. Each company would be a different pool. And swim lanes would be departments within the same company. What I use the most for the process that I work with is that each pool is a subdomain, and each swim lane, it's a bounded context within that subdomain. But you can use your own, define your own criteria. For example, it could be business units, and within those business units could be your products. So, but the idea remains the same. You are establishing some boundaries for the responsibilities. The beauty with this is that every time you see an arrow crossing a swim lane or a pool, it is a dependency. So very simply, by looking at any diagram that you build, you can highlight what would be the affected participants that my new or updated flow would cause. So that has an interesting support for you as a developer to assess the impact. Finally, and you don't necessarily use them so often, but those general artifacts, they provide additional information that it's not covered necessarily by the other elements shown so far. So they're not events, right? They are not decision points, they're not tasks, but they represent, for example, if you are having some sort of persistence where you are storing some information throughout the execution of your process, you may use that element to do so. Annotation is simply a way for you to add a note to give you some visual information. And this last one is rarely used in my case, but it can represent when you have some data that you want to highlight as being the input to some part of your process. But like I said, I rarely use. And this brings me to let's build one, right? So when we're going to build one, I want to stress out the fact that one of the key aspects that I follow is I want to be as practical as possible. So I never try to say to my product team, hey, you have to read this 500 pages specification of BPMN before you can actually contribute. So the key here is from all the elements that we just saw, and we have some modifiers, what makes sense for us to use. And what makes sense for me may not make sense to you. So whenever you go into the modeling, make sure that you really pick from all the available ones the minimum that allows you to capture the message that you want to convey, right? So to showcase what we're going to do. So I'm going to use one software called Lucidchart that is a general purpose diagramming tool. So it's not one that is specifically focused for BPMN, but in practice, you can use anyone, right? So there are some other BPMN specific tools. Some of them allow you to simulate your flow and, you know, provide some inputs and see what would be the output of that. But for many cases, I want to see, my included, it's too much. So a simple diagramming tool would serve the purpose, okay? So with that, let's leave this for a second. And let me go here. Let me open up. So hopefully you can all see. Unfortunately, these elements are perhaps a tad small, but I'll try to zoom as I go. So imagine that the example that I'm going to give is a fictitious, e-commerce one, where a customer has, placed an order, has done whatever it needs to be done. At one point in time, you have to take care of the actual fulfillment, which means I have to ultimately send the physical goods to the consumer, right? The one that purchased. So you've been given the information that, well, after the order has been in place, right, which means that everything else that you don't really care to know took place, you gotta do the fulfillment. And as part of the fulfillment, because you have many locations, is you have to determine what's the fulfillment center, the place that's going to ship ultimately the items, and you have to do the pick the element from the location where it is, put it on a box, which is we call packing, and actually ship it. So send to the carrier so it can go away, right? So with that information, we can start by saying, well, I'm gonna have my, hopefully it's big enough for everybody to see.
Yeah, it's good for me.
Okay. So you let me know if it's too small. I can zoom in out. At one point, we'll have to zoom out because this will grow. But the idea here is that I'm going to represent what's the trigger, right? So what starts my process? So my process is going to be the fulfillment one, right? So here I'm going to say that a customer order was placed, right? So I'm taking this as the trigger for my process, and from it I'm going to say, well, what do I do? I just said that the first thing that we have to know is I have to find out the physical location. So I am going to determine the fulfillment center. I'm just shortening for sake of space. And then I said that after that, I have to pick the order items, then I have to pack the order items, and then I have to ship the order item. Or let me put it, let's say customer orders. And finally, I say that the order was fulfilled. So right now, I have my process. I have a start event. I have a series of tasks that need to be taken care in a specific order, and I have the outcome, right? So I have a process. In this case, what are we going to do? You could start talking to your product and say, okay, but here I determine what's the fulfillment center. Sorry, determine the fulfillment center. So what's the fulfillment center that's going to take care of all these other tasks? But what if I don't have a fulfillment center that's capable of doing that? How can we represent? So remember the gateway. So I'm going to determine here, and I'm going to add a gateway. And there are several types of gateways. Maybe it's too small here, but remember I told you about the exclusive one, which is the one that it's only one option that gets executed, and say found a fulfillment center. And here, not found. So if I found all's well, right? I was able I'm able to move on. But if not, what should happen? And either your product or you talking to them is going to say, well, in this case, we need to cancel the customer order. Otherwise, the customer maybe has paid already or is expecting that order to come. And well, after that, the fulfillment cancel. Right? So you are done. So as you can see, we're evolving this process by adding more elements to it. And here, just to showcase, again, this is where you would pick if that it's relevant for you. But all those three activities, they are activities that are supported by a system, a software, but they are driven by humans, right? So essentially you have somebody that physically picked the item and maybe scanned to make sure that, hey, I picked the item, and so on. So when you click on a task, you're going to see that there is an option for you to add a modifier here that says this is a user. So here I am conveying to whoever reads this diagram that these tasks involve humans driving the software. And there are other modifiers as well, right? So there's no point in trying to cover them all here, but the point is you don't actually have to use all the available notation to convey your diagram. Be careful to really pick the ones that capture an important information for you. If something exists but it's not important, you don't necessarily need to go out of your way and figure out how to capture that in BPMN. So that is my experience, right? Again, your mileage may vary. So that's why I'm always saying, use your context at hand. As we evolve this story, and again, this can happen during the initial discussions or as you truly implement things, you could say, well, we found out that before I go in actually start picking and packing and shipping the orders, you may have to cover the fact that orders that are very high amount, they require some special handling. For example, you have to request an insurance, right? Because if that gets lost, it's, you know, I as a retailer, I don't want to lose that money. I want some insurance to take place. And because of those high value customers, we want to ship them faster because, well, the customer paid so much, there's an expectation to receive it sooner. So those are not technical concerns, are passed on by the business. So it means that prior to us doing this, you may say, well, oops, sorry, not this. You may have a second branching here that says, well, it's here. Total bigger vehicle, I don't know, $1,000. Those are your high value customers. And if the total is less oops, than 1,000, right? So less than 1,000, I continue as is. But if it's bigger than 1,000, I want to say, well, the very first thing that I want is, like I said, request insurance. Then I want to check the, I don't know, processing time, because based on the processing time, I want to say select priority lane, right? So essentially, I wanted to tell which of the many lines of activities of picking that I want to give based on maybe the processing time, the one that's taking the least amount more efficient, and so on. I want to go there. So then you could say, well, if after I do this, I come here, right? So I am evolving this as I learn. And to check the processing time, you gotta look at the current orders being processed, right? Being processed. Okay? And as each one of these activities take place, I'm copying here just for make sure that the diagram does not have so many crossing lines. You are updating. So again, evolving this. I want to perhaps do a quick pause and see if there's any question at the moment before I continue to expand on this diagram.
Yep, you can feel free to ask via voice or put questions in the chat. So for me, from my side, so far so good. I will.
So far, so good.
I already wrote some questions, but I think that I won't be interrupting your
All right.
flow for now.
So let's move on. And here I'm trying to grow this to illustrate some of those elements that we saw that you're likely going to find out. So one thing that we want to say, well, cancellation of the customer order, it's not a task per se that I will do here, right? I am going to essentially ask, because remember, I was not the one that actually received the order and done. I am just taking care of the fulfillment aspect. And here you want to say, well, I'm also not waiting for this outcome of the cancellation. I am essentially just saying that there has a cancellation, but I don't, I'm not waiting for that to take place, or I don't even care that it actually takes place or not. That doesn't affect my process. So one way to translate this would be, hey, I'm sending some sort of event, most likely, or write some messaging for which I'm not necessarily care to wait for it. Then we can annotate our task with this symbol that essentially is a symbol that says, I'm sending a message, right? So just to keep something here. Also, let's start to introduce something that here you may not see as necessary, which is, oops, hold on. Let me scroll a bit down so I don't mess around. And here, I want to say, well, this takes care on the warehouse. And let's increase this here. Sorry. This is where things become dicey. So here, all that I'm saying is everything that you see here is responsibility of has been acted on by this participant, right? And like I said, I like to use the concept of your subdomains and your bounded context. So let's evolve this even further a bit. So imagine for a moment that you're going to say, well, all this part here that you see on the top, it's more on some sort of, dispatching or routing, where this lower part, it's really more on the operations, right? Because it involves people with maybe physical access or having concerns that I don't necessarily. So I here, if you see, I'm not worrying about, picking, packing, shipping, and all this activity. So you can say, well, let's break it down. So let's add another swim lane. And here, like I said, the names could be, I don't know, dispatch, and this could be fulfillment or operations or whatever. And then you're going to say, well, these things here are actually here, right? So let me reduce, because it's not, we don't need that much space. Oops, sorry. And then you start seeing that, well, I have a process that begins and ends here, but that at a given point, I have a collaboration taking place between this responsibility and this one. They're still part of your process. Everything is working as normal. And you say, well, I'm already start to see. So maybe this, in our technical terms, would be maybe this is one service, or maybe one component does not need to be, you could have that monolith where you have those modules or components within. And we are still enhancing the solution that we're building. But we can go a bit further. So you see here, this seems to be accessing the orders being processed, but it's not actually the case. What we're doing here is we want to know the orders that are being picked. So I do here say, well, get list number of process orders being picked. Oops. Let me just rearrange a bit. And I come back here. So I am not exposing a concept here that does not belong into the other one. I'm still refining the responsibilities prior to developing, or as I develop and I do the necessary rewrite or refactoring. Then, to kind of finalize, let's imagine a collaboration not with your own subdomain. So imagine here that you have to determine the fulfillment center, you have to interact with your inventory. Right? So here, may have to expand this a bit. But essentially, you would say, well, I need to do something here. And we know that's a different type of messaging where I'm going to check available inventory. Then I'm going to find expired reservations, because maybe I found inventory, but it's associated with another order that's no longer relevant and I need to reuse. Then I could do whatever are the other tasks that we would go and want to say, well, all this is nice and dandy. However, it's not going to work. So let's go here. You want to say that the thing is, here, I'm going to wait for this answer. And I would then make my decision based on that. So as you can see, you are enhancing this and adding the necessary pieces of information to your process. With this, you're capable of looking at the dependencies that you have. By having your gateways, you can challenge what can go wrong. Every time I have a dependency, you can or should assume that something can go wrong. Should I establish some sort of a graceful degradation? If I don't find a suitable FC, should I really try? Or what if for some reason I cannot get the insurance? Should I still move on? Or should I stop waiting for something? All of these are more easily highlighted in the visual form that can be used not only during the development, but later on. Because imagine you are onboarding a new developer, a new product member, and you need to perform maintenance, to add a new feature and so on. If you have an element like this, you can look at it and at least challenge yourself and say, I understand the dependencies. I don't know exactly the code that takes care here. I don't know about the data structure and access patterns that I'm establishing here. That's what your source code and other technical documents look like. But you can very easily understand the end-to-end, especially if you consider that if you are like me, more often than not, the onboarding practice that you have for new members is they are responsible for bug fixing, for addressing those small things, so they get knowledge on the source code. But if they don't have something like that, they do not necessarily understand their place in the life cycle, in the flow. And with that, I want to go back to our presentation so we can talk about process. So I hope I was able to showcase an interactive mode where you can use the elements that are available to you in BPMN and just the ones that make sense to you to capture the events, to capture the actions, and to do so in a way that you can speak the same language that business does without them having a high context switching and having to learn about a lot of diagramming standards to be able to contribute. But how do you apply the BPMN as part of your development life cycle? Ultimately, be up to you. But one thing that I've seen helpful in me, to my case, is start by listing the processes, right? I need to fulfill the order. I need to cancel the appointment. I have to reschedule something. So list all of them. For each one, start like I did. Forget about swim lanes, pools, or anything like that. Don't even put gateways if that's possible. So you are more or less going for a happy path if the swim lane, sorry, if the gateway provides you some error or alternative scenario. Then you go and iterate that, either with your product team or by yourself prior to coding. So go until you have enough visibility to say, I can see it end to end. Then split if it starts to become too big. As you saw, and again, I use this in a very simplified manner, the diagrams can start growing very quickly. So you use the tools that you have at your disposal, such as sub-processes, to simplify that. If you do this and you work in iterations like Agile or Scrum, and you are having your sprints, every sprint, as you're going to develop something and you finish developing, look, is there any new knowledge that's relevant to be added to my BPMN? If it is, go for it. I promised that I would talk about common issues, and let's go through them. Very quickly, these are the ones that I've found more often than not, that I find that I call them very simple. So you have processes that they don't have the begin or the end event. So be careful, make sure that you establish what's the trigger, right? So what starts your process and what's the outcome from it. Second one is activities. So the tasks that we put, they don't have action verbs. So they are tasks, right? So they are, in some cases, if you were to translate this one-to-one into a CQRS, they would be your commands, right? They would say, hey, do this. So there is some sort of action verb associated. And finally is, as developers, and we probably are transitioning from very technical driven documents, the common mistake that I see that's very simple is you start adding technical details for that. So, and whenever I look at the diagram and I see data, information, details, I already know there's something wrong, right? So, or, oh, I'm using, SQS. I say, really? And if I change from SQS to Kinesis or to other messaging, does the process change? No. Then the fact that you're using SQS is a very important information to be part of another documentation, not on the process. The ones that are more medium, meaning they happen, but usually you stumble across it further down the adoption of the BPMN, is actually the one where you have too many elements. So you get so carried away and you start going and adding more and more processes. And again, this is not necessarily one I would call, but it had to fit the screen. So bear with me for a while. So what you see here is that I have a lot of elements, right? On, again, a lot being relative here, on a given pool, or I have two different domains and information about the process that happens on both. Then I would say, well, what can I do to help, right? Too much information has some issues as well. So one way that you're going to see is that when you have a lot of tasks that you logically can group together, you can create a sub-process. So here, if I go back, I had this request insurance, estimate processing time, and choose priority lane, and I hid all of them under a fulfill high value order, right? Still follows, let's say, the same rules, right? I have an action verb, and I don't have a technical reference here. Hopefully high value order is actually even part of your ubiquitous language. And it is a sub-process. So when you can do this in many tools, but when you click on this, it would open this sub-process here. So you can still see what takes place, but you can control the visibility detail that you want, right? So this helps you with, again, focusing on the bigger picture and going down to details as needed. You can also use they're not mutually exclusive, right? You're likely going to use both depending on your case, is what they call like a black box approach. So in the case of the black box, you don't want and you shouldn't care necessarily about details that go inside other domain. So you see inventory here, I'm not actually care what takes place here. I just know that I have my interface points from there. So if you see yourself going to too many details, feel free to use at least one or both of these techniques. And to conclude, focus on what matters, right? BPMN is not a technical diagramming tool. It's supposed to capture end-to-end how your products and services will interact with each other to deliver some sort of business capability. Make sure that the dependencies are highlighted there. The biggest value to me is if you are able to adopt this because you're talking to somebody that's not technical. You're still going to benefit, in my opinion, of having it, even if you're solo, if you will. But the benefit that this shines is on breaking the silos and make sure that you don't fall into the waterfall mistake where you only start developing when you have the entire BPMN capturing every single aspect of your entire flow. No, go for it. The moment that you have an end-to-end, start iterating. Normally, if you use that as a guide, your knowledge, your questions will only enrich it. So with that, I want to leave you with 2 additional resources. I'm going to share this this presentation, of course, and no kidding, I have this 12-minute tutorial that it's out there. It's not mine. That for me is a very good, bootstrapping tool for you to get started. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. I really enjoy it. I saw the comments that people also liked, especially this live part about building BPMN. So as you said that you like to have fun. So from my perspective, it was clearly visible through that storytelling and showing how you gradually building the BPMN process. I really, really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Yes, David, I will send that on the link to tutorial in both Discord and after I publish recording. I will try to search that in the meantime. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask with Mike or write it on the chat. I see that there is already a first question. So can you use it with the event storming? That was also one of my questions.
Yes. So the answer is yes. Yeah, we can use it with event storming. I use it with event storming, right? So the approach that I like to use is this. Event storming for me is great. And the biggest value that I see on event storming is, right, it's even easier if you think about it than BPMN because it has even less elements for you to memorize. To be honest, when I go with a business, I essentially only use events and the red post-its for the points to discuss further or that have some problem solving. But the moment that I finish the event storming session where I have a kind of understanding of the sequence of events that takes place, I usually go and switch to a BPMN. So I ask for the product and the engineering team to take that knowledge that we just gathered, that we discovered, right, with the event storming session, and we capture in a BPMN. Mm-hmm. Because to me, the BPMN, it's easier to reference and modify, especially in the future, because again, I did not show because I had just a one tab, but usually what I do in Lucidchart or whatever is the other solution is I have one tab for each process of my feature, right? Placing this, canceling that, routing to something, whatever is the process. So it would be separate ones. And it's easier to locate than the nature of the event storming is kind of that infinite roll of paper where you have everything, even if you have digital format. So yeah, mm-hmm. I hope this helped, this answered.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question because you mentioned when giving your best practices or how you do it, that start with comments and messages or other basic flows. So do you think that this is also like the part that you would potentially start with event storming or event modeling? Because that sounds quite close to, at least in the discovery phase.
Yeah. So again, I am. If I, to me, the event storming shines when there's a lot of unknowns,
Mm-hmm.
where there's a lot of discovery, right? So there is a somewhat clear intent. I need to do that, but I actually don't know what takes place for me to do that, especially maybe even today. Usually, event storming I find interesting when you start approaching some place where there is already a running software and you need to expand it, but nobody actually knows or has enough documentation on that.
Mm-hmm.
So the practice that I've done not as often, but I've seen reference by Alberto itself, is that you start with just events, right, on event storming. Then you do a second round where you kind of go to the maybe commands and
Mm-hmm.
some small, aggregates here and
Mm-hmm.
there. So you start capturing naming and so on. And then, yes, I jump into the process using those names and discoveries that I just
Mm-hmm.
had to start putting, because then it becomes easier to see end to end and to represent, and if necessary, even go back to event storming because you just found out something that was not captured there and needs to be clarified.
Mm-hmm.
But yes.
Yeah, I think that the second part of the name, so storming, suggests that it's better like when we need
Yep.
to storm our ideas and challenge them. Yeah, I agree. But so if you are, let's say that you are past this discovery phase and you are starting to work on the process as you show us, so do you also like use it, for example, on the meetings with both business and technical
Yes.
people? Because
Yes.
I mean, like you are, it was clearly visible that you are really fluid in that, and but yeah, I think that it's yeah, it was for me, it was quite impressive that you were also able to build narrative, because quite often BPMN is shown like, this really hard tool that you need to sit with the book and not other people, etc. And
Yeah. So like I said, I mean, if you go into the spec, right, there are of course certain there are meaning for those symbols and how you should use it, but there is a point where they say it's up to the modeler.
mm-hmm,
So uh, I think part to kind of put your information in context is it's it's as easy as workflow, right? People, business people usually they are, they're used to that workflow where you just have literally arrows going from one place to the other, and the sophistication comes when you start breaking the responsibilities and so on. That's why you don't get there overnight, but you have to start tailoring the diagram to the audience that's going to go. That's why, for example, that last part where I had the white box, black box approach, saying, if I am talking to my warehouse domain team, they don't care about what takes place inside the inventory, let's say. So I don't represent. So it's easier to bridge this and to have this narrative that you just saw. But it takes time.
mm-hmm. So from your perspective, who has harder time to understand those diagrams, business or developers?
Yeah, I mean, both in different ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, to be honest, developers they have an easier time following due to the logical aspect that it
Mm-hmm.
conveys, right? The trouble comes when they have to maintain. because
Yeah.
if you're not careful, you're going to see, databases and information that's not really relevant as to a process being added there. So I think that business usually, because they have less time to look at things in some ways. So that's why you have to be careful with the amount of information. That's why an art is for you to understand the narrative and capture in a way that you can flow by it quickly.
Yeah. So yeah, and so my next question, and maybe I will just add that if for others, if you'd like to join, then feel free to ask questions. I have my notes, so I will be asking them, but feel free to interrupt me or ask yours. So my next question was about how to maintain. So from your experience, how, like, when the process evolves, or let's say that we have our initial diagrams and initial agreement and some implementation, then how the maintaining of that documentation looks like, who's responsible, or I know that it depends, but at least what works maybe usually best for you, or what doesn't work, what would be your thoughts?
All right. So usually what I recommend people doing is this. So first of all, this is a collaborative document, right? I know that our audience here, it's probably mainly with a still strong participation in the actual technical aspect, right? But because we're here, I'm assuming we always look beyond the implementation. But why I bring this up is our challenge is to take a BPMN that is not a technical document and make sure that it's introduced to both audiences. Because if you don't have that today, it means that your non-technical team does not use it. Your technical team does not use it either. So I start, like most cases, I build myself, I present to both, and after that, it becomes an expectation to be maintained by both. How? Every sprint or every iteration, right, you're going to work on a set of features that hopefully you're working like this. So you have your BPMN that describe enough, gives you enough context so you can actually go into development. As you go into the development, you're going to learn things. As part of the definition of done of that iteration is to update the BPMN, right? And this is truly a collaborative thing. So it depends on how well you are, with your relationship with your non-developer counterpart, but he or she would maintain that. Moving forward, a new project comes, what do? We take from that BPMN, not everything is going to change. You create a clone of only the processes that are going to be affected, and you make the changes. So we discussed before implementing, and similar thing, as you finished, you merge back those changes into the main process. So in the beginning, you're likely going to be the one doing that as a developer, as the one leading, let's say, the project. But by showcasing the value to product, you start sharing this responsibility with them, and it becomes, again, a collaboration. So it's never perfect. Like any documentation, that requires some attention. And the easy way to find out that perhaps you went too far is when you don't change the process, but you actually have to change the BPMN because you change the implementation. So it's likely mean that you are adding too much, too many implementation details on a document that should not have it. So this is the kind of the warning sign that you say, hey, but hold on, the process remained the same. I just changed the implementation. Am I always constantly having to change the BPMN as well? So maybe you have too much there that shouldn't be on the BPMN. And anyway, so this helps addressing your question, because I speak for myself, but I have constant changes, but not all of them needs to be updated in the BPMN because they are refactorings, optimizations, things that do not change the actual process. So there's no point, no need to update in the BPMN.
Yeah, I think that that's a really, really nice heuristic and learning that it's if you constantly need to update BPMN as you're going with implementation, then that means that probably you put too much detail. I really like it. I mean, it's not on. I think that it's not only about BPMN, but here it's. I think that's on point, on money.
And that's what drove me away in a bit from UML, okay? Because I felt that it was abused by trying to capture almost like the actual code sequence. Let's say if you're talking about sequence diagrams that we would have, and that essentially is outdated the moment that you finish, because when you start developing, you're actually changing all of that, right? So to give a context, I have business process flows that I implemented using AWS step functions, right? And I changed the implementation, but I don't change the process. So the document remains the same unless the process changes. And that's the beauty.
So on that part, one more question, like how to frame it well, because I was also talking with one of our known people from the community, and he's on the other side than I would say what's really right now fashionable. I'm not saying that this is good or bad, just I mean he's a fan of BPMN and doing the analysis before the implementation and so on and so forth. And on the other side, a lot of people are also want to have like the source is in the code. So for example, we have, you know, those mermaid and other tooling that help us to reflect what we have in code in documentation. And what I notice, or at least that's my observation from what you were saying, is that also BPMN is more about process. So like it's different perspective on the development process. So what's your take? Like how where do you put the main point? Like whether you try to keep them really aligned, or are you just find that there might be some mismatch between those two models?
So yeah, so I don't have the solution, right, for that, because to be honest, I find that to a certain degree, with the exception of the actual source code, which is the executable aspect of you know, what we produce, everything else, including the mermaid, there's no guarantee that just because physically it is part of the repository, that it is up to date and reflecting the actual, whatever is trying to capture. If it's a state diagram, if it's a sequence diagram, if it's a class diagram, and so on. So the BPMN, independent of the tool that you use, unless, like I said, you're using something that I don't necessarily see relevant for every single use case, which is a business process engine, which is something that actually runs the process that you just captured. I find it that let's say the mermaid in the repo versus something else to share the same limitations when it comes down to out of sync, right? So to me, the art, because it's not a science to me, is finding the right balance, which is putting really just what matters. So the major decision points, right? That's why I like the BPMN, because if you are true to that, you are going to put just what you have to, in the same way that if you're building an engineering document, there's only so many details that are really relevant to the point that you're trying to make. More than that, you're just asking to be more work for nothing. So my take is, pick your poison, but both have the same limitations. One, to me, has one advantage, that is I can walk on many worlds, and the other maybe only serves to a certain part of the audience. And without disrespecting ourselves, many of our problems they have, when it comes down to the actual technical implementation, very simple, well-established, documented patterns, or recipes, if you will, to go. Whereas understanding the problem is the key. Otherwise, you're not going to implement the right thing. You're going to overcomplicate, or the usual problem. So I would I am biased, but I would go with the BPMN or any other way that focus on the problem understanding first. If you can use that and still start with your repo, all the better. But don't be fooled that if you don't update that, it's going to go out of sync as well.
Yeah, so let me guess, but so you probably also are not a fan of tools that are go the other way. So like, for example, I don't know, like I saw that Camunda can generate some code, or Salesforce also provided, I think, even their own version of BPMN, or you mentioned SAP. So do you think that the other way, so when we have the BPMN process, is it possible to use some code generation out of that? Or have you seen
so
working in some projects?
So okay. So I think if the solution that you have gives you that flexibility, and answers the question, so whatever is your requirement, let's say functional or non-functional, it does that. I would say use it, okay? Because you have something at your disposal and you're not using, it's kind of throwing something away for no good reason. The only thing is that, like, the problem lies, to me, when you have those tools and at one point you have to add your custom code, right? So when you do that, it's where you start having some fragmentation, because you have a process in one place and the code in another, right? So you start to have the same situation where you have my process in one place my code in another. So why would I choose a tool that does that unless it's already part of my ecosystem? So I would not add one unless it's already part of my ecosystem. So the Salesforce or SAPs and many others, they have this kind of BPM, they call business process manager, built in on their solutions. But yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree. I could see that maybe some initial code generation to speed up the boilerplate work, but maybe, I mean, I was once a huge fan of Windows Workflow Foundation, and now I shouldn't be even mentioning that because that's quite shameful, and I burned my and got my scars out of it. I mean, it's a really nice idea to have such connection, but as you said, it's really hard to, for the same way as we discussed from diagrams at code, that there are always some challenges. I mean,
Yeah.
it can work to some degree, but yeah.
Yeah, it can. Again, for me, I would say it's really if you already have a tool that provides that capability and satisfy your requirements, I would say, give it a try, really, because chances are the integration benefits will be worthwhile. But if not, I would be sticking to say, I'm going to choose something to document my process, to enable collaboration, and to somewhat make our lives easier when it comes down to maintaining and introducing new team members to the fold. But that's it.
Okay, so if I may have one more question.
Yes.
So how would you go, like if we discuss that, getting diagrams from code is not always the best option, or generating code from diagrams is not always the best. So what, how do, or maybe do you use some other tools like, I don't know, C4 model, or how, because you mentioned SQS and Kinesis, and I agree that putting that on BPMN is not the best idea, at least it doesn't look like. But if you're in, for example, in AWS Stack, then you have those SQS diagrams all over the place. So how would you go and transfer what you have in the business process into more like, I'm not saying even code, but more technical architecture or system design?
So what I do is that we use C4 here as well, right? So we pick from C4. Again, it's always case by case. So you are going to use a certain technology. So your, let's say, infrastructure architecture, if I call this way, will consist of whatever elements you think you're going to need, cloud-based or not, so Kubernetes and languages and so on. So usually context diagram I recommend, because that captures at least for us some of the decisions, such as what's the languages, what's going to be the hosting option if you're going serverless, or some sort of host like Kubernetes, and so on. And if there is an aspect of your solution that you really need to decide on, example, am I going to use Kinesis or SQS or whatever, or I have a very specific need, I don't know if I should go with a MongoDB or Event Store DB or Postgres. Have an ADR where you are putting your options and using the criteria that you have to pick the best one. So what I recommend is, again, 99% of the cases, go with the BPMN so you understand the problem. Then you go for a C4 diagram, usually context, depending on your case. And I go for an ADR, if there are technologies that you are unsure which one to pick to address, maybe the hosting, the compute, the persistence, or something like that. So to give you an idea, there was a project where we did the BPMN, and then while we're discussing, we decided to use event sourcing. Then we said, what's going to be the solution that we're going to leverage for the event sourcing, to publish the streams, to generate our projections, and so on. So this is a separate document, but it is that case. For many others, the solution is almost standardized, so there's no point in adding that document just to capture the obvious. So yeah, so it's nothing sometimes.
Yeah,
But that's it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It would be, I'm not sure if there are any tools, but it would be good if you could also connect such C4 diagrams with those BPMN.
Well, what I do in Lucidchart is Lucidchart allows you to link elements, right? So what I do is this: whenever there's a technical aspect that's relevant to a task or to a process at hand, I add a link in the BPMN to this other document that describes this. So, and if you do this, with some diligence, again, as the less is more, that's more or less my take is, you're good, because then you can always jump from one to the other, and don't worry about duplicating the actual knowledge, because you want to talk about tech, you go there. You want to talk about the process, you go there. So you have, everything has its place.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense to me.
All
Cool.
right.
Cool. So I see that MJ is also leaving. Guys, do you have any questions to Mario? I think that I went through almost all that I had. I mean, it was really super insightful. I learned a lot already. So what would be your final advice? What we should do after this webinar if we'd like to start with BPMN?
So look at that 12-minute video, right? Because it's definitely going to showcase a completely different example. So you have, again, another type of storytelling taking place, just as a reference. And to me, pick one process, maybe from an existing project, and something that you have already developed, so it's a bit of reverse engineering of sorts. So you can practice this, you can practice this exercise of, is that enough information? Am I capturing the essence of this? Am I, how am I going to represent this situation that I have here? So it's going to usually highlight that. And that's it, and if you feel happy with what you just saw, is add to your development cycle. What you probably today, every one of us has some sort of process that we go. Just figure out where to put it, and and that's it. And I'll be around, and if you need any questions, you let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Great. I really enjoyed it. It was super practical and actionable. I mean, the whole webinar and your insights in the Q&A part. So I really enjoyed. So thank you a lot.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and I hope you all enjoy. And thank you very much, and until next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.